Well, tēnā koto katoa, no America ho no te tematanga, ko te taita toku manga, ko waitaki toku awa, ko ototahi toku kainga inai nei, e roia toku tunga mahi o Perryfield Lawyers, ko Stephen mo toku ingoa, no reira nā mihi kia koto katoa. Well, it's wonderful to welcome everybody here, and we're really excited that so many of you have joined, and that there's a lot of interest in this topic about the charities and the changes that are being proposed in the Charities Amendment Bill. And we are looking forward to talking some of the key points through with you. My name is Stephen Mo, and I'm a partner at Perryfield Lawyers, and this is Sophie Tremuen, and she works in the same team as me. And we do a lot of work with charities and what I like to call for-purpose organizations rather than not-for-profits. Because why should we define ourselves by what we're not? Why don't we define ourselves by what we are for? So I've written a whole blog post about that, if that's of interest, because I think it's something that we could actually do better on. But our purpose today is we would like to discuss with you some of the changes that are put forward in the Charities Amendment Bill and really give a download of our perspective on some of the key things. And ultimately, our hope is that some of you will feel empowered to go and create a submission and have your say in this important aspect of democracy, which is we have an opportunity to make our voices heard. So that is the intention for our session. And just before we hit record, I was asking in the chat for people to put where they're dialing in from. And it was wonderful to see just such a cross-section across the entire Motu, all the way from the south to the north. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that this is something that is going to affect everybody. So thank you for joining us. Just before we dive into a bit more of the detail, I always feel obliged to explain I have an accent, but always be careful when you hear someone with an accent, because it's not always what you think. So I actually moved to New Zealand when I was 7 years old, and I'm not 95. That was in 1983. So I grew up in New Zealand, went to school in Christchurch, worked in a law firm called Russell McVeigh in Wellington for 3 years. And then I left New Zealand for 11 years. And so I've practiced as a lawyer in London, Tokyo, and Sydney, and then came back 6 years ago to work at Perryfield in what I call our purpose-driven team. So we help lots of organizations that are involved in for-purpose activities. And so that's why through that role, I've been involved with the Charity Services Sector Group. So that's a group of about 20, 25 of us who provide input to them from time to time. So basically on a quarterly sort of basis. So I've seen up front, front and center, the process that's been followed and how we've gotten here. And I'm happy to answer questions or talk with people offline about anything. The chat function, I know you know how to use it because many of you typed in where you're dialing in from and what the weather's like. So we do welcome any questions that you've got as we're going. I'm not planning to spend the entire time talking because I think that would be really boring. I would much rather have an interactive session where feel free to put comments in the chat, and we'll do our best to go through those and give an answer if we can. Sometimes the answer is, I don't know what the answer is, but we can always look and find it, or at least give pointers of things to be considering. So what we thought we'd do is run through in this session. The other thing is there's going to be 3 of these over this month, because obviously there's a lot to cover. There's no possibility that we could cover everything unless we've made this like a 3-hour-long session, and I don't think anybody wants that. So this one, we're really just going to be giving an overview of some of the key changes. And then because of my perspective as a lawyer, I want to talk about some of the legal considerations and some of the legal side, but I also want to make sure that you feel empowered to know how to make a submission. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on what it actually involves, because I'm aware some of you maybe have never submitted to a select committee. So I want to demystify it. I want to make it as simple as possible. And I want to clarify some of the myths, like submissions don't have to be 10 pages, 20 pages, 50 pages. You can choose the little bits that you care about and send that in. That's a submission. So hopefully this will be helpful. And I'm obviously aware that there's a massive spectrum of people on this call. As of recording, I think we're about to hit 70 people. So some of you are going to go, well, I know I used to be on a select committee, or of course that's simple, but not all of us will have done it. So bear with us so that we can make sure that everybody is up to speed. Yeah. So how did we get to where we are today? I just wanted to start with a couple opening thoughts and comments. So the Charities Amendment Bill, and also if you don't mind just double checking if you're on mute, it would really help. It's hard for me to monitor, but I can pick up a couple sounds there, so somebody might not be on mute. But the Charities Amendment Bill, it's been kind of around now for a while in terms of the process to get to this point. And I think obviously COVID has a lot to be blamed for, because there's been a lot of delay. Because of COVID, there's been pushing out of considerations and things. But in 2017, at that point, the Charities Act had been around for about a decade, and there had always been a commitment that it would be revisited or looked at again. And so in 2017, the new Labour government came in and they announced that there would be a review. And that it basically started from then. So I've kind of seen it since that point. And obviously that's now like, what, almost 5 years ago. So it's been a ongoing process. It hasn't been a quick thing. And I think I have to choose my words carefully here, but I personally don't think it's been a bad process. Like, I know some people are maybe saying that we needed actually to have a wholesale review of the entire Charities Act. I think it's good to have different perspectives and different ways of approaching things. From my perspective, I actually think that if we got what we wanted, or if we got a wholesale review of the Charities Act, I'm actually not sure what the outcome of that would be. And sometimes I think it's better to have what you know than what you don't know. So from my perspective, I actually think that having the tweaking that's gone on here, it's not a wholesale review. It's not a brand new legislation. It's not revisiting first principles basis what is charitable. I actually think that an argument could be made that there's merit in that too. So the fears that I would have is that if there was a first principles review, that might be a time for charities to actually lose some of the ground that they have. And the two obvious examples would be income tax on charitable business. So if a charity owns a business and it is receiving money from that business, I just worry that could be something that gets revisited. Is that actually something that should be allowed under the charities regime? So that's the first example. And then the second example, there's a more trendy term is spirituality, but obviously there's 4 charitable heads: advancing education, reduction of poverty, advancing religion, and purposes beneficial to the community. And I do have a concern that if there was a first principles review of the entire act, that somebody might say, well, what about this thing called religion or spirituality? And should that receive the same position from a charitable perspective? So for those reasons, hopefully that wouldn't happen, because if you actually dive deeper into what religious charities provide to this country, there's massive benefits which go well beyond any accusations of certain religious groups and the conduct of certain leaders of those religious groups. But there's a huge amount of things which are done throughout society. So I don't want to get diverged off onto a tangent. I do want to get into the act. I just thought it was helpful to have a couple opening comments because I don't view it in the same way as the house is on fire and everything is burning down. I view it more that we work with the tools that we're given. The Charities Act has been around for a while now, and this is now revisiting some of the provisions in the Charities Act. And I do worry if there was like a wholesale review that there could be potentially outcomes that we didn't expect. So hopefully that helps, even if it's nothing else, just a different perspective, because I know that there's different views about this. So that is my view in terms of where we're up to. And as some of you on this call will be aware, at the end of September was the first reading of this Charities Amendment Bill. So it had been in the wings for a while, and we were given 6 weeks to respond. So actually looking at the calendar, that was going to be tomorrow. The 9th of November, I think, was the date that charities were given to respond. And a couple of us looked at that and thought, actually, it's just not very much time for charities really to get their heads around some of the changes, to be involved in the process, to provide submissions. So a real shout out to Sue Barker and others who were instrumental in suggesting to me that we should hold a session talking about the changes, and then also that we should write a letter to the select committee and ask them for longer. And we were successful. So that was really good. And thank you to everybody on the call who was part of that. I think we had about 120 different charities who signed the request for an extra month so that more people could submit. So it's just a good example that if you, in this sector, oftentimes people sit back and say, well, that's just the way it is. But it shows that if you do raise your voice, if you raise your hand, there can be change. So it was a really positive thing. And hopefully everyone involved in that can see, actually, this was a really good thing. And I know that other groups are running sessions about the changes and empowering people to actually submit. So that's really great, because otherwise there wouldn't have been time. Like literally tomorrow was the shut-off date. So that's really good. So that's just a bit more of the background. So when we come to the Charities Amendment Bill, you have until the 9th of December to put your submissions in. And so, Sophie, if we haven't done it already, we've done an article about what the key changes are. And we've also done an article about how to make a submission. So what I'd like to do is run through some of these key changes, but also I want to make sure that you know how to make a submission. So in the chat there, see, Sophie's in 2 places at once. She's sitting beside me, but she has her computer and she's leaving links in the chat. So feel free to click on those, and hopefully it then gives you some really practical steps about what's changing and how to submit. So I've got the bill in front of me right here. This is something which you can easily download. You can have a look. There's an explanatory statement, and it goes into what are some of the changes, the process that's been followed. And I just thought I'd read from the very beginning. So this is the framework of what's going on. And they say, the objective of the bill is to make practical changes to support charities to continue their vital contribution to community well-being, while ensuring that that contribution is sufficiently transparent to interested parties and the public. And then it goes into how it does this. So what we're going to do next is just talk through some of the key changes, and feel free to be putting your questions in the chat. One of the changes, which actually isn't in the bill, but I think is important, is the reporting, which will need to be done by larger charities on how they're using their assets. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And Also, yeah, just before I hand over to Sophie to run through the first point, the other two sessions next week on the 15th, I'm really fortunate that the Chartered Accountants of Australia and New Zealand also care about these issues. And Zoe, who's on this call, I see, is going to join me to be sharing about the reporting side of things and the accounting side of things in terms of what are some of the changes and what might be some of the concerns that would be in light for charities. So thank you in advance, Zoe. That's going to be a great session with you. And if you've signed up for this session and you want to join that one, make sure you put your name into that. And then the third session is going to be with the Institute of Directors. So they have more than 10,000 members focused on governance. And on the 22nd, we're going to be talking about governance aspects. So the reason I mention that is that we're not going to cover both of those topics in this call. We're going to be saving that for the 15th and the 22nd. So I thought spacing it out a bit gives us a chance, hopefully then enough time for you to submit as well. So we're going to run through some changes, and we're just going to have a bit of a dialogue back and forth, make it a little bit more interactive. So Sophie, why don't you start us off in terms of what are some of the requirements for officers and in terms of the governance of charities? Do you want to chat through that?
Thank you, Stephen. So the bill includes some clarification and additional requirements around the role of officers and along with the governance of charities. For example, the bill sets out that the role of an officer in a charity is to deliver its charitable purposes and comply with its obligations under the Charities Act. And the bill also expands on the definition of officer, which is quite an interesting point that I'm sure you'll want to comment on, Stephen. So what it does is the bill, sorry, I'm just pulling it up for a second so I can get the wording right. Oh, thank you, Stephen. Right.
Which clause are you after?
I'm after, it's in clause 4, I believe.
Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. So clause 4 of the bill, it expands the definition of officer. So in this clause, I'll just read it out so you can have an idea of what it's doing. Officer in relation to a charitable entity means a person who is able to exercise significant influence over the management or administration of the entity. It also includes, but is not limited to, in relation to the trustees of a trust, any of those trustees. So if your charity is set up as a charitable trust, then the trustees are officers. And then in relation to any other entity, a member of the board or governing body of the entity, if it has a board or governing body. So for example, if your charity is a society, then it'll be the committee or the officers of that society who are officers under the Charities Act. What are your thoughts on that, Stephen?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I am going to make a submission on this just because I suppose the point is, who is it going to capture? And is it going to be an expanded definition? So that's one of my concerns. I think that maybe there could be a bit more working through actually what's this going to mean in terms of who qualifies. Because I do worry if there's any gray area, it's going to be confusing for people. And in talking with MB and some of the people there, I know that there's a desire to align the definitions across all the legislation. But it is something that I'm going to raise. And we are going to talk about this one in more detail with the Institute of Directors. Wonderful. To be able to get their perspective on this cause as well. So I'm not going to preempt that by going into that more right now, but it will be something that and just so you know, to make this really practical, like we're right now working on our submissions. It's not like we've already fully formed them, like we're literally working on them right now. So yeah, so I know there is a desire. I see Pauline's comment there, a similar definition. Yeah, I think it will be similar, but it's something I haven't finished my own thought on this. I just know I want to make a submission about it, because my worry is that if the definition of officers becomes too broad, then it's going to capture a lot of people who maybe shouldn't be considered that. You know, I think it's kind of obvious if you're a trustee of a trust, you know, that you're at that level, or in an incorporated society, if you're on the governing board or the committee. But I do worry if it trickles down too far, if it's, going to be too broad. So
we had a couple of questions come through about whether it could technically capture a board member's wife or a CEO. So there are implications for that section.
Yeah, it is interesting. And maybe this is an overall, one more fundamental point is just that there needs to be clarity over who's captured and who isn't. But if you read it, it means a person who is able to exercise significant influence over the management or administration of the entity. So I guess potentially it could be a bit broad.
Absolutely.
So that is definitely something I'm going to be submitting on.
Great.
Any other ones that you wanted to?
In terms of governance, the bill also introduces a requirement for a charity to review their governance procedures, which includes the constitution or trust deed or whatever rules the charity has every year. What are your thoughts on that, Stephen? Yeah,
on that one, to start with, I can't tell you how many times I've had a client approach and they started in pick the year, 57, or 1932 or 1982. And I can tell that they haven't looked at their rules for decades. And so I do have a worry that there's a vast number, including some of you on this call, who haven't looked at their rules for a very, very long time. And actually, they're very outdated. And the terminology which is used, and perhaps most importantly, the protections which are offered for trustees or officers are stuck back in the past. I've even seen examples of trust deeds where there's no clause that allows for amendment of the trust. So that leaves you in an awkward position. What do you do then? Sometimes you have to start up a new entity and transfer the assets over and wind up the old entity in order to really get best of practice rules. So that's something that I've seen a huge amount of needing to upgrade the rules. And bear in mind, we have the new Trust Act 2019. So that has a whole bunch of different rules that apply. And I think for many, even on this call, many of you would have trust deeds which well predate 2019. And that came into effect about a year ago. So there's a lot of provisions in there that probably could be reflected and be clearer about what are the trustees there for and what are their liabilities and things. So the point of this is that I think it's great for charities to revisit their founding documents. What I'm not sure about is this really something that would be needed on like a yearly basis, reviewing their procedures and things and their trust deeds? This explanatory note, it does suggest that this will help promote good governance and require people to be checking if they're actually achieving their charitable purpose. But I guess my hope would be that is something that is happening or would happen, and it wouldn't be something that's needed on a yearly basis. As a side topic, some of you are incorporated societies, and as you know, there's 24,000 of those, and all of them need to re-register. So we're finding that this is a real refreshing moment for incorporated societies to be able to go, actually, do our rules even apply anymore? Or do we need to adopt, well, they will need to adopt new ones, but is it even reflecting what we do? So I guess one encouragement for those of you on the call would be, go find your rules, have a read of them, and actually work out if you're complying, because I'm pretty sure there's going to be clauses in there that say, for example, before a meeting can be held, 2 weeks written notice must be given to trustees, or, like little quirky things that you're probably not complying with at all. So it is a good process to upgrade your documents so that you are. So that's kind of my thought on that, in terms of how often you need to review. So I think it's a good idea to review. I'm not against it at all, but is it something that needs to be mandated in statute as a kind of a yearly basis?
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Sophie, I might get you to have a look at the next one as well, and then answer your thought there. Yeah.
Sounds good. So the second key change introduced by the bill are financial reporting requirements. So the bill allows the regulator of charities to exempt very small charities from the Tier 4 financial reporting requirements. So the standards, the charities that qualify for this small charity exemption and minimal reporting information, that will be set in regulations, but the idea is in the bill around these very small charities being exempt from the Tier 4 requirements. Thoughts,
Yeah,
Stephen?
so I think this is a positive development as well. The reality is that many of these small charities, and some of you on this call represent those small charities, are stretched. You know, there's limited resources, limited volunteers. And so I think helping alleviate some of these reporting requirements, particularly for these smaller ones, you know, these are trying to capture the ones where there's a couple $1,000s of turnover, or, you know, the threshold, I don't think it's been set, has it? But from my experience, it might be thinking about really small ones. So I think what we might do on this one is next week, let's talk with Zoe about some of that from her perspective in terms of reporting requirements. But I get the intention behind it, which is that it's trying to reduce some of those obligations for the smaller charities. And
it would be great, Stephen, if the smaller charity, those requirements lined up with like the Incorporated Societies Act, because that also introduces for smaller societies, just to keep that consistency across.
Yeah, it's true. Okay. And then third area.
So there are some changes to regulatory decision making. So just for a bit of background, there are two regulators under the Charities Act. So we've got the Charities Registration Board, and then the Chief Executive of the Department of Internal Affairs. So the bill, what it does is it increases the processes these regulators are required to comply with when they exercise their powers under the Act. And the explanatory note talks about how this is designed to align with best practice and enhance transparency, fairness, and accountability of those regulators' decision making.
Yep. So yeah, I think one of the changes here is they want to increase the number who sit on the board, which I think is I think I'd be in favor of that. It's an interesting area, and what we might do is send out when we circulate like follow-up material to this call. I might include some other information about this in terms of do we need to have a really independent do we need to have something that's completely separate? Because right now, I think the process involves Charity Services as the regulator bringing material to the board. And so I guess there's a question there is, should we be revisiting having something that is sitting outside of that department sort of structure? I think what we'll do is send some more information about that in the follow-up. But some of you may have views, so let us know in the chat what you think. How about the next one?
The next key change we have is changes to the appeals framework. So at the moment, the High Court hears any appeals on the Charities Act. So if a charity has any issues with any decisions that have been made, that goes to the High Court. So the bill, what it's doing is introducing a new authority to hear appeals on the Charities Act. So this is the Taxation Review Authority. And the explanatory note to the bill says how this authority is the most appropriate existing tribunal to hear the appeals, owing to the link between charities and tax, because charities don't pay tax. So there's some sort of historic link there. Do you have any thoughts on this appeals framework, Stephen?
Yeah, so we had discussed this in another call as well, whether this is really emblematic of the approach towards charities, that it would be a taxation related body that is involved here. Like, is that how charities are viewed? I think somebody's got to do this, and I'm not sure that there's a lot of cost involved in setting up a new sort of tribunal or a new way of having decisions be made. At least this is the conversations that I've had with people. So I'm not sure that setting up a brand new entity or a brand new authority is really going to be a realistic target. And so in that sense, if you step back from the detail and say, well, instead of the High Court, who else could it be? Then it does make some logical sense that this would be the appropriate entity. But I still, you know, maybe it's just my gut reaction to why is it this taxation body? Like, why is that the appropriate one? So, yeah, it would be something that maybe you want to explore and look into the bill and see if that's something that you would want to submit on. And really, the purpose of this call is to point out some of the changes so that you hopefully are encouraged to dive a bit deeper and work out what the position of your entity would be about them. Yeah, I wanted to mention one other one before we move on, which is new section in the bill. It's clause 6 and it's 12A. And this is talking about how the chief executive will consult on significant guidelines or recommendations. And it's just interesting that that consultation is with people that the chief executive considers to be representative of the interests of charitable entities. So on that one, I think it would be better if there was a more open process where anybody can contribute and be involved in those guidelines. I know with the IRD, they recently revisited their charities pamphlets, you know, describing what they do and how they do it. And as far as I know, that was kind of an open consultation, like anybody could provide feedback and input. So I think something like that would probably be better. I just worry if there's ever any hint of like, we'll just consult with the people who represent the people rather than just consulting with the people. So it's kind of more of a philosophical point, but that might be something that you'd want to make a submission on as well. Cool. And then let's see, I think those are some of the key points that I wanted to draw out in the link in the article that we've put in the description. We have outlined some of these points, and also we put in links to different things. So hopefully that will be helpful. One of the things that I wanted to touch on is, and then we're going to turn to any questions that people have put in the chat as well. But I just wanted to mention that it actually isn't that difficult to make submissions. So Sophie had put in earlier how to make a submission, and that's in this this article here on how to make a submission. And what I worry about is that people will view this as a big hurdle, that it's really difficult and that it takes a lot of time to read the act, and it's very onerous and it's going to use up hours and hours and hours. And I guess the encouragement I would have is that it doesn't have to. You can also say that you would like to talk to the committee in person. You know, that's an option if you want to. Submissions do need to be written, but when you do it, I think there's even a tick box that says I'd like to present in person. So the submission, sometimes in some ways they don't have as much value if they're just copy pasted from somebody else's submission. Like, here's the template and just copy paste it and add your name and sign off, because obviously people can tell that you copy pasted it from some other source. So my encouragement would be for each of you to be outlining maybe a little bit about the context of why you're submitting, who your charity is, outlining the key concerns that you have, what it is that you aren't certain about, and then asking to appear before the select committee if you want to. Obviously, there's constraints on on doing that in terms of time and effort and things. But the key thing is that it doesn't have to be pages and pages and pages. It could be just one paragraph. So even some of the things that I've mentioned, some of it's you're going to be like, well, I don't really care about this. I don't really care about that. Oh, but I care about that one point about officers and who is an officer, or I care about that one point about charities services. They need to be consulting with the whole sector. So that's fine. And you could just write about that one point. Don't worry that it needs to be a long essay. It could just be a paragraph or two. And when you go through, there's a link to Parliament's website and then this particular select committee. I think in the article, there's a whole bunch of links to how to do this, but you can click, I'm ready to make my submission. You fill in your details and you say if you want to make an oral submission, and then you either upload your submission or you complete this, the form that's required. So yeah, just to reiterate the time frame, we have until 11:59 p.m. on Friday, the 9th of December. So that's basically 1 month exactly. And I would love it if there are lots and lots of submissions. I think that it is important. I hope my comments at the start didn't make you think that I don't think it's important. I do think it's important. I think having our say is really vital and critical. So please do submit. Yeah. So what we might do in the remaining 10 minutes or so is just look at any questions which have come through, and feel free to type any comments that you've got. And we obviously haven't gone into all the details that is possible, but we did want to keep it manageable in terms of time frame, and bearing in mind that next week we're going to be going into more of the regulatory side, and then also the week after we're going to be going into more of the governance side. So hopefully that makes logical sense. Yeah, so Sophie, maybe we can pull up the chat and we can have a look at some of the comments or questions that have been left for us.
Of course. We have a question on what other powers will the Taxation Review Authority have?
That is a great question. And like I said, I don't know the answer to every question off the top of my head. So
while you're doing that, I'll pop the links in there for you, Rich, for the next session.
Yeah, I see someone was asking about next week's session and the week after. So they are separate links. So you need to sign up and then we'll send a specific Zoom link for that session. This link won't work next week. I think what we might do on that specific question is follow up. We'll send out information after this call to everybody who's on the list, and we'll pull out the bits in terms of the Taxation Review Authority and what actually they will, what powers that they'll be given.
I think in terms of their powers in the appeal process, I think they are the first sort of authority
first
here in
court
the bill.
call. Yeah,
unless they decide to refer it to the High Court or refer it to the High Court on a point of law. Does that sound about right to you, Stephen? Yeah,
that's right. I just am not familiar with the exact provision in the act, in the bill, in terms of if there's anything extra that they might have, which I think is what his question was getting at. So it's okay, we'll pull it out.
Absolutely.
All right. Do you want to read out another one, or should I pull it up here?
The next question is recourse to the High Court subject to leave from the Taxation Review Authority?
I think we will put that in our answer out as well, but my understanding is that it's an appeal process. So it would be, you would have the right to appeal a decision from from that authority
Of course.
up to the High Court.
We also have a question on whether or not a submission can be made as a private individual as opposed to an organization.
Yes. Yep, it definitely is possible to make submissions. Yeah, so if any of your individuals feel free to make submissions, that's definitely possible. And I guess if you're doing the work for your organization and it's making a submission, then it could be tempting to copy paste from your organization submission and just add your name. But again, the people who are reading it, like, they're going to know that it's the same. So you might want to consider tailoring your submission to be different to your organization submission in order so that it has the maximum impact. Yeah. Yeah, and I'd mentioned as well, and I knew I would forget to do this, but the larger entities that need to report. So remember at the start, I was saying there are going to be some changes about the reporting that they need to do. And the key point is that if you have accumulated funds or if you have assets, then going forward in the annual returns, so it's not actually a change in the bill itself. It's going to be a change in the annual return form for charity services, where they will be requiring you to explain how you're using your assets or your accumulated funds in order to advance the charitable purpose. So that is quite a fundamental difference to now. The grounds for requiring this is that they want to promote transparency and an understanding of how large organizations are using the funds, so that organizations can't just sit on millions of dollars for decades and decades and say, well, we're never actually going to use it. So that's kind of the rationale behind it. But there is a philosophical point there, which is if a private individual gives money to a charity, then it's really between the charity and the private individual as to how those funds are used, rather than government coming in and saying you're not using your funds to advance your charitable purpose. So I worry that it could be a precursor to other action if the charity says, well, we've been fundraising to do a building. That's actually a bad example, because that's a great reason to not be using your funds. Like, it's taking time to build up the funds. But if a charity said, well, we're sitting on this amount of money, and we do plan to use it for charitable purposes, like, is it at some point, is government going to say, well, you need to use it within this time frame, or else there's going to be some consequence? That's kind of where my cynical mind jumps to in terms of what might this lead to in the future. But I also have heard the arguments that actually it's just to give the public trust and confidence in the charitable sector, that they're not just hoarding away non-taxed funds and aren't actually using it for charitable purpose. So Zoe is going to be on the call next week, and she sent me a direct message in the chat saying we can discuss this next week. So thank you, Zoe. I see you there, and it'll be great to have your perspective and find out a bit more about this, because I think it is something that is causing a bit of concern among charities, that what will this mean? Like I say, it may just be a simple thing that in the annual return, you'll just have to write a one-liner saying these funds are held for X purpose. But because it's a shift, I think it's important to know about it and be aware of it. Cool. And yeah, just to answer that other question that Sophie's put in the links, if you drop them in there, the other Humanitic sessions. Yeah, so they're in there. So you can click that to sign up. I think we have more than 100 people signed up for those. And then obviously people drop off on the days due to other things. But yeah, we're looking forward to doing that. Yeah, I see a comment there from Mark Peterson as well. It will become important for organizations to make sure they have a reserves policy and a strategy for how they intend to use cash reserves where they're significant. Yeah, it's a great point. I think it will be increasingly on the radar, shall we say, if you're having to fill in every year, how are we using our funds and what are they for? And yeah, I mean, the other side of that is that I do worry that some charities are sitting on massive amounts of money or assets, property, whatever it is, and they've kind of forgotten why they were set up. And actually, maybe it is time that they took that money and used it, because there's a lot of need out there in society. And the argument against that I hear from trustees all the time is we're saving it for a rainy day. We need to hold on to it because we don't know what's coming. But my counter argument is, well, look at the emergency housing list, look at the needs in society. Like, when is the rainy day gonna be enough for you? So I would like to encourage, particularly some of you who represent very large trusts and charities, and I know that there are millions and millions of dollars sitting in a bank account earning nominal interest rates, which are causing Australian banks to be more profitable. Is there a way that you could revisit your investment strategies and consider maybe doing some impact investing and actually achieving your charitable purpose through the use of your funds, perhaps by investing in a business or supporting a social enterprise, getting financial return, but actually having impact through the use of your funds. There's some great examples of this happening in the country. Yeah, and if anybody's interested to know, is this possible? Just drop me a line. I'd be happy to share some examples that I've seen. And I maybe just to point out as well, some of you are from religious organizations. The Anglican report into impact investing that came out about a year ago is really excellent. And I suggest you all have a read of it, because it asks some hard questions about stewardship and how you use funds. It's called E Waka Eke Noa, we're all in it together. I think it's motion 13 from the Anglican world. So might be of interest to some of you. And if you can't find it, just send me an email. You hopefully have my email now. So hit reply and send me a note. I'd be happy to send you the link to it. It's public, it's not a private thing. So that's why we can share about it. Yeah. Emma, thank you for your comment from Philanthropy NZ. And you've just said here, recent XRB reporting guidelines for tier 3s, which is likely to influence tier 1 and 2s, have proposed a change for how accumulated funds are reported in the future. Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. I joined the XRB advisory panel a year ago now, and so they provide input to XRB from time to time. Well, basically every quarter we gather and talk with them. And you're right that guidelines has been consulted on. I would encourage you, hopefully, keep your eye out for different consultations that these authorities are running, because we need more people to contribute. And the XRB is the one that sets the financial standards for New Zealand. So if you ever see something that you think isn't right, or you have a question, feel free to drop me a note, because I'm happy to be a conduit to pass on feedback to them through that committee. Great. Anthony's got a comment there. And so we can cover this more next week. Would it suffice if a large fund were being held and the income used for the required purpose? I think that's the type of thing that they probably would be fine with, because you're explaining why it is that you're keeping the fund. I think what they're probably what they're trying to get to the point of is, we see that you have $10 million sitting in a bank account, and the interest that's being earned is going to further increase the fund, and you haven't used it for 25 years. Do you have any plans for this? Like, what's it being held for? So I think that's the heart of what they're trying to get at. So yeah. Cool. Well, this is good. Lots of engagement on the chat. Let's see.
We have a question around whether there's anything that you think we should be thinking about or considering as a result of the bill when rewriting our constitutions for re-registering under the new Incorporated Societies Act. Any thoughts?
Under the new Incorporated Societies Act. Well, that's actually a fascinating topic. And Sophie and I have done multiple sessions about that. Do you mind putting in the chat the Incorporated Societies Resource Hub? So yes, the short answer to that is you will need to re-register, and you will need to adopt new rules if you're an incorporated society. And there are definitely things that have to be changed because, for example, you'll need to be having a conflict of interest provisions. You'll need to be talking about officers and how they're appointed. You'll need to be being clear on the purposes. There's a whole bunch of things which in the previous Incorporated Societies Act 1908 were not covered in detail, but now with the new act, and that new act has 270 sections, the new act does require it to be in the rules. So in this resource hub that Sophie's just put the link to, we've done more than 80 frequently asked questions. So have a look through those. And we've also done a guide for incorporated societies. So if you're interested in that, just let me know and we can send you a copy. We sent it out to hundreds and hundreds of people now. So hopefully it's a useful resource. So yeah, the session here, I don't want to leave you disappointed in that I'm purposefully not telling you what you should submit or what you should say. The aim of this call is really just to give you a high-level overview of some of the key changes. And my encouragement is now feel empowered to dive into it and now hit click and open the bill yourself and have a read, look at the explanatory statements and work out for your organization and your context, what would be your thoughts? What is it that you want to say? So I don't want to steer you like, oh, you need to say this or that. I really want it to be more of an empowering session where you now feel like, okay, I can go and prepare a submission. So that's the heart behind it. And that may be why I'm not going into all the detail as well about this or that. We are planning to prepare submissions ourselves, then we're working on them now. So I think we will probably make those available for people to have a look at before the submission date so that you can see the style and some of the points that we're making. So we hope that that would be helpful. And maybe just before we finish off, this guide I mentioned, Incorporated Societies one. This one is a guide for charities. That's about 70 pages long, and it goes into different aspects of being a charity and running a charity well. This one here is an impact investing guide. Remember, I was talking about how do you use your funds. I did it with the Center for Social Impact, part of Foundation North, and it provides a framework for what impact investing is. And if you haven't explored it, I'd encourage you to look into that. And then the other resources is this Social Enterprises in New Zealand, a legal handbook. That's a book about what social enterprise is. And then we've done a specific guide really looking at religious organizations. And so that is now, just put that out last week. So it's called 7 Principles of Governance for Faith-Based Groups. So if that strikes you as being a topic that would interest, let me know and I can send it to you. Just hit reply to the email that sent you this link and I'll reply with the document. It's a PDF. And the last thing to mention is that I have, for the last 5 years, been doing a podcast called Seeds. And the aim of it is to tell inspiring stories of people who are doing good in our world. Too often in the media, we're hearing the negative. So what would it look like to hear the positive stories? So that now has 332 interviews with people. And Sophie is going to drop that in the chat. It's been downloaded. I checked today, I think it was more than 170,000 times. So it's gotten quite a lot of traction. You know, every episode gets several hundred listens, but I always welcome more people to find out about it. So if you're in a commute anyway, then why not listen to somebody's life story and be inspired? The most recent ones have been Brianne West, who founded Etique, which is a beauty company. So she's done amazing work. Lloyd Mander, who's involved with the Institute of Directors. He's the branch chair in Canterbury, and we talked about diversity of thought at the boardroom table. What does that look like? And every week, it's a very different person. So I've talked with 6-year-olds about being 6, 92-year-olds about being involved in palliative care, real variety. So that might be of interest to some of you. So I thought I would mention it. So that just leaves me to say thank you so much for joining. It was great to have so many of you activated and interested in, hopefully we made it a less than dry topic. And it was I just wanted to give you an overview of the key points. I want to empower you to now make a submission, and I want to encourage you to come back and join us next week when we're going to deep dive into the reporting and accounting side and what does that mean for entities. And then the week after, we'll be looking into governance and how does this mesh with governance and best practice with the IOD. So thanks, everybody. And I really appreciate the comments in the chat that you've appreciated what we've had to say. All the best. Have a good rest of your weeks. Cheers. Bye.